Hello, Matthew. I'm glad to see you again, and I want to say that our previous interview left a strong impression on me, and I'm still kind of inspired by your approaches to your life and service. Tell me more about the people in Ukraine who have inspired you in the same way.
Oh, let's see. Some of the people that have inspired me have been both some Ukrainian individuals and some other foreigners. There's, some notable figures, including, a U.S. Navy SEAL that was killed in Bakhmut. I wear his memory on my wrist, along with a bunch of others that I fought here with that, wear this as well. And he was a good fighter, and it was an honor to fight next to him. And one of the things that stood out to me about him is when he was injured, shortly before his death, he was still walking and talking while having a bullet in his brain. And that showed me, a new and different example of what it means to just not quit. Even in a really bad situation, that there's a time and a place that, quitting is just not an option. And for him, that was something that he really showed me and others, that even when you have a bullet in your brain.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about the story, and when I'm thinking about it, my eyes always like opening.
Sure.
Without even some special things I need to do. I'm just like, what? How does it possible?
I've already briefly introduced you to our viewers, but I like to hear from you directly. How did you, American veteran, ended up here in Ukraine?
So I'll start off from just as a young person, I've always had the passion to help and serve others. So I would say maybe around the age of 8 or 9, I decided that I'd probably be joining the U.S. military. So that way I could help and serve others in that fashion, primarily to help my country. And as I grew a little bit older, understanding that my country normally sends our military to other countries to go and help those that need it as well, which provides additional security for us. Once I got a little older, I decided to join the United States Marine Corps, which is its own military branch. We do a lot of different things, including stuff regarding water, but a lot of stuff on land as well. And then 9/11 happened, the terrorist attack in New York City. So by the time I was ready to actually join the military at the end of high school, then we were already fully within a war ourselves in Iraq. So I joined there. I did 5 years active duty, got trained as a Marine Scout sniper. That is something that has helped me out with the rest of my life quite considerably. After I did that, during that time, by the way, I did 2 combat deployments, one to Iraq and one to Afghanistan. While I was in Afghanistan, I had some good, unique opportunities there of interacting with some of the Afghan locals that showed me and some other Marines some of the evidence of what the Russians did when they invaded Afghanistan during the Cold War. So that was really one of the first times I was able to see that what my government had told me about Russia doing evil stuff to civilians when they invade a country, and how they are our #1 enemy in the world currently, and really ever since the end of World War II, so that's almost 100 years now, that this was the first time to see evidence backing up what I had been told. Because sometimes, governments are not fully honest.
Yeah.
So I really appreciated that, to see that what I had been told and taught was accurate. After I got out of the Marine Corps in 2010, then I actually went back to Iraq as a security contractor. I spent over 2,000 days there over the course of 9 years doing 15 deployments for a private company, but contracted with the U.S. State Department, providing protection for the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad, and for a while at the U.S. Consulate in Basra, which is down in southern Iraq, until we shut that location down. After that, I did a couple other things. I was a program manager of about 80 employees in the state of New Mexico for a government contract for the United States Air Force. And then this invasion happened. When I saw this, again, it really re-sparked my desire to help and serve others. And I saw that with the invitation from the Ukrainian president of, foreigners coming to help, to join this brand new legion, that I felt it was my duty to use my skills and my experience and my passions to come over here and help protect the Ukrainian people and do whatever I could within, the battlefield here to actually make that a reality. So I spent a little bit of time doing some research. I understood very quickly that this would be very different than the previous wars I had done before, Iraq and Afghanistan. So I wanted to do some research before I just jumped into something that I really didn't know anything about, especially at that time. Russia was known as the second most strong military in the world. And that was something that, as an intelligent person, you shouldn't just jump in to decide I'm going to go and fight the second strongest military in the world as an individual, because this context was I would be coming over here as an individual by myself to join people that I'd never met before, never trained before with, or anything like that. So spent some time doing that. Finally, at the end of May in 2022 is when I physically came over here.
You told me several times that you feel a strong passion to fight evil, both with weapons and without. In your opinion, where does this drive came from? Like, what in your childhood or young?
That's something that would definitely be coming from my childhood. And, as I grow and mature, then I better evaluate, how many of the good things I'm going to do compared to the bad things. And sometimes, do the bad things that I shouldn't be doing and usually regret it later. But as a young person, I don't remember how young I was, but I was pretty young when I understood that a little bit about having a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And that was something that was very instrumental to me and a substantial influence in my life. Thankfully, my mom spent time taking me to church, and I was able to understand a little bit here and there as a very young person. Also, I had a very interesting and somewhat chaotic childhood. That my mom had some mental illnesses, some trouble with drinking, and some other things, to where I started doing adult stuff around the age of 7 or 8. So that was, for me, at the time, it really just seemed normal. It took me a few years to interact with other of my peers to realize that was normal. At my house was not normal for other people's houses, for most of them. So that was something that, my passions of helping and serving others, I was, putting into action pretty early. So that was, again, around the age of 7 or 8. I'm 37 now. So that's about 30 years of doing adult stuff, starting at such a young age. So that shaped a lot of my decisions in my young adulthood. Of how I conduct myself, how I interact with people. That's part of the reason why I've never really been one to drink alcohol, do drugs, because I see that if I can't be in the proper state of mind, then how am I able to take care of myself? And if I can't take care of myself, then I'm useless to be able to help and serve others.
You recently came back from the US, and what motivated you to return here? Because you were 2 years spending on Ukrainian battlefields, then you went to US, and now you're here in Ukraine again. Why?
So yes, I did 635 days here in Ukraine before I left, and when I left, I was gone for approximately 6 months. During that time, I did a lot of driving, about 20,000 miles or about 32,000 kilometers of driving around the country, along with a couple domestic flights as well. And that's where, one, I needed a break. There's studies that show that the time spent in a battlefield situation should not exceed 7 to 10 months, something like that. We learned that after World War II. So I needed my own break, and I wanted to spend time back in the U.S. And I felt that with everything I'd learned at the front lines, especially being at so many different parts of the front lines here in Ukraine, that I could do a lot to really share my voice, to increase support, and really mostly just educate those that just don't know what's going on here, just in Ukraine in general, and especially at the front lines. So part of that allowed me to have an invitation from the American Coalition for Ukraine to go to Congress at the U.S. Capitol and be able to share my story there as a subject matter expert of the frontline operations from an American warfighter perspective. And that was something that, for me, was a huge honor, a huge blessing, and also a pretty big burden to carry, to be really the only person that has that. There's a lot of other Americans here, some Americans that got here before I did, but I'm extremely confident that I'm the only U.S. citizen here that spent 635 days here in Ukraine doing combat operations during the majority of that time without leaving the country. All the guys that got here before me, they had left the country numerous times before I did. So I used that title that I believe that I hold, along with all that experience, to have a very loud voice about what is going on here from the American warfighter perspective. And that was something that I believe had a massive effect, not just at Congress, but just talking to your average voters. With all the driving that I did, I talked to people all over the country from all different backgrounds, sometimes just at gas stations, sometimes at big meetings and fundraiser events, stuff like that. So I think it was very powerful. And one of the things that was going on during that time, that I went to the Capitol. It was in April, and that's when, you know, it was a big deal talking about this most recent aid package that had been argued for, you know, 6 months. And one of the things that was talked about there is the urgency of voting on this aid package and the importance of it. And again, what we're seeing on the front lines from the American perspective, which also talks about like the corruption and stuff like that. There's a lot of politicians and voters that understand and have been told that there's a lot of corruption going on and there should be no more aid packages. And so I was able to provide information from my perspective and let them know that I haven't seen, you know, an Abrams tank disappear or a howitzer artillery piece go into Zelensky's pocket so he could pay for a vacation or something like that. And that was very instrumental. So with all of that, you know, I was very proud to see that Congress said yes to the request of voting on this aid package as soon as possible. And within just a few days, they voted on this aid package. And as we assumed, you know, it was a pretty strong yes vote overall. And, you know, it was on the president's desk with, I think, within about a week of my time there, you know, talking and sharing my story, my experience. So again, I was not the only one there. There was a lot of people there with the American Coalition for Ukraine at the Ukraine Action Summit. But I was definitely the only one there as a subject matter expert of the front lines. That's been such a huge amount of time at the front lines and here in Ukraine. And that definitely, you know, carried very heavily. So I'm very proud to say that, you know, I'm at least a small part of an aid package for, you know, 60 billion worth of supplies that Ukraine desperately needs for frontline operations.
And I'm pretty thankful to you for that, because I'm pretty sure that the big things are doing, like these small efforts are crucial for the big things.
Absolutely.
That has been doing. You mentioned that you have never heard about Ukraine before you come here, and you spent more than 2 years here in Ukraine. What things have you discovered about Ukraine, from the good and the bad side?
Let's see. Some of what I've seen here is that Ukraine has had a difficult time really breaking away from the Eastern influence from Russia. That Russia, they're bad at a lot of things. Most of the things that Russia's known for is, you know, just being bad at, you know, they're bad at government. They're bad at providing for their people. They're bad at providing for their own military. So they're bad at a lot of things. However, they're very good at influencing others. They're good at the propaganda. They're good at their disinformation. So they're very good at infiltrating and influencing others. And it appears that Russia has spent considerable resources to infiltrate and influence the government and policies here in Ukraine, which means that Ukraine wasn't able to fully adopt Western policies and a Western culture like some of the other border states have, like Estonia as an example. And I single out Estonia. I've never been there, but I had the honor of having a former Estonian officer from the Estonian military that was in the Legion with me here in Ukraine. And I got to learn a huge amount from his perspective about how things are in Estonia compared to Ukraine and some other countries. And they were able to adopt a Western culture very quickly, you know, after the fall of the Soviet Union. And, you know, their country is much smaller than Ukraine, but very, very different from what my understanding than what goes on here. You know, the way that they have things a little bit more organized within their military, the way they use technology, you know, over there, from my understanding, all you need is your identification to go to any hospital within the country, and they can just scan your information from your identification and pull up all your medical charts. You know, it's all electronic. Estonia is also the ones that created Skype, which used to be an extremely common way to do video chats and a very secure platform for messaging.
Yeah, they're also making an elections by the internet. Yeah, for example, I think this is the one country in the world with such system.
Yeah, so you know, that's a great example. And whereas here, all the hospitals I've been to here, you know, there's so much stuff that's only on paper. Paper is easy to lose, and when you go from one hospital to another, the new hospital has no idea what happened at the previous hospital, and you know that creates a lot of problems. And you know, we're still working on a lot of that stuff ourselves in the United States as well. So we haven't fully figured that out. So that's just one of the examples of a country that fully adopted the Western culture and is very successful for their small size, compared to Ukraine that is still struggling because there is such a heavy influence from the East and from Russia. And I believe that, you know, this most recent invasion back in 2022 has shown the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian government, that it's time to completely cut ties from all Eastern and Russian influences, and to fully, as quickly as possible, adopt the Western cultures and the Western influences to, you know, take advantage of the success that comes with the Western culture and how we just do things differently. You know, some stuff is better, some stuff is worse, but, you know, we in the West, we just do things very differently. And so far, it works pretty well.
I hope that we are on a stage of final cutting of this influence now, but I know a little bit how it ends up sometimes also in our history of last 30 years, and I'm hope, but I can't be sure, unfortunately.
Sure.
But this is the most important thing, what is happening right now, this war, and I hope it will be decisive for finally we will be free of this influence.
And that's something that I find very interesting, because I've talked to a lot of Ukrainian civilians, primarily in Kyiv, but in other areas of the country as well. And one thing that I found extremely interesting is how many of them would talk to me about how they were in disbelief that this invasion happened in 2022, that they could not believe that their neighbors invaded. So for me, just from the Western perspective, I couldn't help but, you know, point out that you've been at war since 2014. So why would it be a surprise that the war escalated to a full-scale invasion?
A lot of people didn't expect that it will be in this way. A lot of people were thinking that it will be like something on Donbass, like very small operation, small but loud, and we didn't expect that the Putin will strike us with the rockets in the middle of the morning, at night, in fact, and Kyiv will be under this shelling and other things. So I can say that we didn't believe, but we didn't believe that it will be in this way.
Sure. And so from my culture, that would never be allowed. So, you know, there's a lot of people in America that don't like California. But if Mexico or whoever invaded part of California, the entire country, even those that don't like California, would decide collectively that this is not allowed. And we got to see a very small part of that in 2001 during the 9/11 attacks in New York City. That for a long time after that, no one was a Democrat, no one was a Republican. Everyone was an American. And we all collectively understood, even if we disagreed about personal opinions, personal policies, everyone understood this is unacceptable, this is not allowed, and we need to go find some people to kill. And we're going to kill a lot of them. And it took us a little while to figure out who it is that we need to kill. And we decided as a country that once we find someone, that hopefully they're the right ones, and we're going to do our best to kill every single one of them. So that way the entire world understands that this will not be allowed.
I hope that Ukraine sometime will be on that stage to handle the danger for our sovereignty, in this way. I hope we will be strong enough as American, but there are also a lot of significant differences in our history and in our mentality, and I'm not surprised at all that things went this way. For me personally, it wasn't a surprise, but this is a topic for the biggest discussion. I think we can talk about it for hours. And now I want to speak about you, and how do you feel your personal connection with Ukraine and Ukrainian people? What does it mean for you?
For me, it's to really see, this is similar like the previous topic of seeing, you know, the things that we have in common and the things that we have not in common, and seeing, you know, which parts of those are just, for me, it's to really see, this is similar like the previous topic of seeing, you know, the things that we have in common and the things that we have not in common, and seeing, you know, which parts of those are just things that are different, and it's okay to be different, and some of those things that are better or worse. And if it's something that can be better, then, you know, I like to find ways to improve myself. So if there's stuff that goes on here that is, you know, better, then stuff in the United States, then it's something that I get to, learn from, so I could better myself and how I interact with others. And hopefully, the same way, the other way around, the Ukrainian people that I interact with can see a small part of the American culture through me. Just like, them being able to see, similar to like my personal relationship with Jesus Christ, that they could see a little aspect of me so they can kind of understand what that's like. So when they're able to see part of the American culture, then, hopefully, the parts of it that would be better, that they could, use that to improve how they interact with their people here. And then kind of understand why we do things differently, and kind of figure out, which parts of that is just different and different's okay, and which parts, can use improvement. So that's definitely something for me that I've enjoyed, sharing my culture and understanding as best as possible the differences of just the Ukrainian culture and also the history here. I have a pretty strong passion for history, especially war history. So with all the warfare that's gone here, unfortunately, for me, it's really cool to just see aspects of it. It's cool to have Ukrainians walk with me down like Khreshchatyk Street here in Kyiv, and for them to point out which buildings were rebuilt by the Germans after World War II. I got to see some buildings in Warsaw, Poland, that were built by the Russians after World War II and stuff like that. That stuff that just doesn't exist in the United States, of stuff.
So you're passionate about being a part of this story.
Yes, and to really see, I've read about a lot of these stories. I've seen movies, TV shows, stuff like that, but to actually be on the ground and seen some of this. I had one of my former team members that was part of the Kharkiv offensive back a couple of years ago, that he was in trenches that had shell casings from the Soviet Union and from the Nazis. That the trench that he was standing in was the same trench used in World War II, the same trench that was used in World War I. So that specific trench, that location, is over 100 years old. And so he got to stand in history also right there. And that's something that was just very powerful to see, to just be a part of, just the honor that comes with that. And also a little bit of the sadness to see that this piece of ground has been fought over so many times in just recent history that, we're in the same trenches all over again like we were 100 years ago. And it helps kind of bring up the question, what have we learned from this? And are we learning what we're supposed to be learning? Because we're repeating the same stuff that we thought we learned over 100 years ago. That trench warfare is stupid.
Yeah.
And now we're back at it again. And it's something that, at least with my generation doesn't know anything about trench warfare. In Iraq and Afghanistan, trenches don't exist. They have some cave systems in some areas, so that's a little different and has some similarities, but other than that, it just doesn't exist. So for us in the West, it's an opportunity to see a different way of warfare within our generation that's actually happening today. So, it's just interesting for me to just see the little bits of parts of history, and again, share my culture, understand the Ukrainian culture, and just see a different part of the world and how other people, other cultures, other nations do things just differently.
So you were involved in many battles on the Ukrainian battlefield, and including the battle for Bakhmut, one of the bloodiest battle of this war. And what situation from that battle is most in your memory? Like, when do you think about it? What do you recall from those times?
Oh, let's see. There would have to be different ones, but one of the ones that stands out would be being outside of Bakhmut, trying to get back into Bakhmut, after the Ukrainian side lost it, and going through some of the tree lines with trenches, with quite a few bodies just all over the place. And the situation there, and the negative part of the situation, is we know the Russians are known for booby-trapping bodies. Yeah. Normally, we find a body, and whether it's from our side or their side, we check the body for intelligence, maps or, radios, anything like that. And then if it's from our side, then we, remove the body, so that way the body can be, taken care of properly, returned to its...
This was the bodies of Ukrainian soldiers?
Both.
Both.
Ukrainians and Russians. So, if it's someone from our side, then we try to remove the body as safely as we can to get it back to that person's family, and for a proper military burial, stuff like that. But out there, because the Russians are known for booby-trapping these bodies with either landmines, grenades, some kind of explosives, we've learned that unless you drop the body yourself and you see the person going from living to dead, that unless you see that, you can't touch the body because it might be booby-trapped. And some of these booby traps, the Russians are annoyingly good at it. Some of the booby traps are very, very sensitive, to where we've learned to not touch the body at all, not check pockets, don't check anything. And when it's away from the front lines, then, you know, we have teams that can go in there properly and do all the proper checks. But when it's at the front lines, there's no opportunity to actually take your time to check these bodies. So the bodies just have to stay there. Ukrainian, foreign, and Russian. In the summertime, it's horrible. Yeah, it's warm, it's humid, and some of these bodies are 2, 3, 4 times larger than they were when they're alive, because they're just bloating and rotting, and the smell is something that I'll never forget for the rest of my life. And then you have Russian artillery that comes in, and sometimes Russian artillery comes and hits close enough to one of these bodies to cause one of these bodies to explode, and then you have this rotting flesh of someone that's been dead there for maybe weeks, and, you know, now flying all over the place, you know, getting even close to your position. And sometimes you're sitting right next to one of these bodies. And again, the smell is something that I'll never forget for the rest of my life. And that is something that is probably the memory that will stay with me the most from anything that touches or around Bakhmut.
And why it was so impressive? I mean, I suppose that you've seen death people a lot during your service, and why this situation was so impressive for you?
It was something that we just did not have this problem in Iraq or Afghanistan. That if we had friendly losses, then, you know, the enemy was not booby-trapping these, because normally there was enough friendly forces that we could, you know, get this person back fairly easily. You know, this fallen angels is what we call them over there. And if it's an enemy fighter, then a lot of times we would move, you know, the dead enemy fighters to an area that the locals can hopefully safely recover the body once we're done with whatever engagement, whatever fighting we're doing that day. So we try to be very respectful of the dead, even if they're our enemy while they're alive. So that's just very different here, of being forced because of the circumstances to just leave friendly and enemy bodies on the battlefield day after day, week after week. And just with the weather here in the summer, in the wintertime, it's not too bad, because, you know, a lot of stuff will just freeze. So there's not, you know, a strong smell or anything. But in the summertime, the smell is just horrific.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I know what I'm talking about, but I think if you are not here, in this situation, it's hard to understand.
And I hope you're never there.
Yeah. And what moment of the war during these 2 years was the hardest for you, like from mental point and physical exhaustion, maybe, or something like that?
I'd say it'd probably be something in regards to fighting during the winter. I generally don't like the cold. So it being really hot in places like Iraq, you know, there's summer of 2008 during my combat deployment there, it would get up to about 145 degrees Fahrenheit, which I believe is about 63 degrees Celsius, I think, if I'm doing the math correctly. That's pretty warm.
Yeah.
I would much rather that than, you know, the Ukrainian winters here. So that's just a personal preference. So for me, you know, spending time in Bakhmut or in Kharkiv area, where during the day it's below freezing, during the night it's below freezing, week after week after week it's below freezing. Sometimes the safe house that we have doesn't have working heat, so even when we're back in the safe house, it's not warm. So whenever we're in a building at the front lines, the building is half destroyed, so it's usually colder inside the building than it is outside, like in the trenches or something like that. That for me, that would be probably the most challenging times, because generally no one likes working in the cold. When it's below freezing out, generally I've never found anyone that's excited to go and do anything outside, whether it's combat or anything else, when it's below freezing out, where it's not your choice so much as, you know, it's your job, it's your livelihood. So us and the enemy forces none of us are out there having a good time when it's below freezing. When it's nice and warm out, we can have a little bit of fun with it, even if it's, combat. But when it's below freezing out, that is for me probably the most challenging times of staying mentally strong, and then hopefully try to stay physically warm enough to be able to use my weapons safely and effectively. Because you lose feeling it's in your hand. It can be almost dangerous to have a weapon in your hand if you can't feel your hands anymore, because your hands are getting close to getting frostbitten.
And the important fact that this is not your home country. This is like the foreign soil. And where did you find the motivation to keep moving? Like what you were thinking about in those moments of exhausting?
So I would say the small scale of that is, in the moment, it's looking to my left and to my right and seeing my brothers in arms. Some that are Ukrainian, some are foreign. So out of the foreigners, it's mostly Americans, but a whole bunch, we've had a whole bunch of other nationalities on the team that in the moment, we're fighting for each other. In the moment, we're kind of not really fighting for Ukraine. We're not really fighting for America. We're not really fighting for Europe. We're fighting for each other. In the moment, our goal is to get as many of us back to the safe house off, at the end of the mission as possible, whether we're out there for a couple hours or a few days or whatever the case is. So that's the small scale. The big scale is seeing that everything that happens here has strong ripple effects for the rest of the world. Taiwan is very interested in what's going on here. South Korea is very interested in what's going on here. And what happens here will definitely shape the rest of the world. And that's something that your average observer of what's going on here, whether they're Ukrainian, European, or American, the average is not understanding how important this is and how substantial these battles are. That it will absolutely shape the rest of the world for the coming few years of what the rest of the world will look like and what will be allowed and not allowed as far as good versus evil.
Did you ever have some doubt about was it correct decision to join this fight?
No, not at all. And that's something that I'm very thankful for. Like I said earlier, I did quite a bit of research before I came over here physically. I was able to connect with some former colleagues of mine that had come over here before me, so I was able to talk to them directly about what the reality is. So I'm not just reading stuff on the internet, not just listening to the news, and that helped me a lot. So no, I'm fully invested in what's going on here, and now my focus has adjusted from using my combat abilities in the trenches to using my voice and my experiences to fight the fight, but in a different way, looking more at the bigger picture and trying to get more and more awareness out there. So that way people can understand that it's not so much of just a good idea to increase support for Ukraine, but it's a necessity if we want to avoid a world war.
And this is the part of answer to the question why I'm so inspired by our previous conversation, because I realized how important is understanding of your mission and what you're doing in life generally when you are fighting, like, I don't know, when you're just living, because it's the thing that keeps you moving all the time, wherever you're doing. And I want to talk a little bit more about your training as a US Marine, because everything I know about training of US Marine, it's shaped by movies in Hollywood and like some books, and in these books they are like superheroes. They're jumping over the sky, over the mountains, they're swimming with the sharks and other stuff. How is close to the reality?
So for those, yeah, that's just all made up, but it sounds super cool. I'd say one of the movies that's out there that has a high level of accuracy is the movie Full Metal Jacket. So the beginning of that movie, it's during Vietnam. The beginning of that movie is primarily looking at Marine boot camp. And then the second half of the movie is, warfare in Vietnam. And that movie has, there's a lot of funny stuff in there, and part of it's meant to be a comedy. But a lot of it's fairly accurate. And one of the main characters during the beginning of the movie, the primary drill instructor, he was actually not even really an actor at that time. He was on set, I believe, as a military advisor or something very similar to that. And the actor was just not performing well in that person's opinion. And this military advisor, Arlie Ermy, he is a former Marine. You know, he was a Marine drill instructor, so he's actually done the job. And so after going back and forth for a while, they finally just cast him to just do and say stuff that he had done and said when he had done the job. And even though some of the stuff is really funny to watch, and some of it seems a little ridiculous if you don't really know the military, if you don't really understand the Marine Corps, but very, very accurate. And part of that is just the attention to detail. You know, the rules are there for a reason. And even something as simple as keeping your belongings secured and locked, like having a locked foot locker, everything matters. So that's something that kind of stood out to me. It's one of the reasons why I chose the Marine Corps, is just knowing and understanding the Marine Corps does things a little bit different than some of the other military branches. And our boot camp is longer than the other branches. So that's a big part of why I did that. And the way we do the training, like before combat, for example, there's a good chance that you might do almost a year's worth of training before you actually ever see combat for the first time. And especially, I didn't talk about the Marine Corps, where it's about 3 months for your basic boot camp. And all that is to turn you from a civilian to a Marine. And that's it. And then after that, you go to whatever school you go to for your specific job. So for me, my primary job was infantry. I went to the Marine Corps School of Infantry in California. That was about another 2 months. So that's 5 months of training there. From there, then once you get assigned to your infantry unit, it's usually right after they got back from a combat deployment. You know, they have people getting out of the military. They have, you know, they probably took some casualties, so they have less numbers than when they went over there. So they need new bodies. There's usually a minimum of 7 to 12 months between combat deployments for the Marine Corps. So once you get there, then you have, you know, maybe another 7 to 12 months of training with that unit, with those teams, with those Marines before you actually deploy. So that adds up to usually at least a minimum of 1 year during active war before you actually see combat. So that's a huge difference than what I see here in Ukraine. And granted, it's a different situation. But here, you know, I know some that might only get a few weeks or a month or two of training, and, you know, they're thrown out there to the front lines due to necessity. And it helps me understand why some of the decisions are made out at the front lines that seem odd to me. You know, some of it's, you know, different, and some of it's, you know, better, and some of it's just wrong. But all of that's just the training and how we do training differently.
Back to those times when you were training for being a U.S. Marine, what was the most annoying part of it for you?
I know one of the times that stands out to me is we go out to the rifle range and we spend quite some time out there. And before we actually get ammunition, we practice shooting for approximately a week. It's about 5 days. And when they explained it to us, I didn't fully understand it. Then we did it for maybe about a day or two, and I started to understand, you know, this makes sense, where you use different positions, standing, kneeling, sitting, and laying down prone, and you aim at a target and you pull the trigger, and your weapon has no ammo. And you just do this all day. And it teaches a lot of different things, but the primary focus is how to pull the trigger properly. Because if you don't pull the trigger properly, then you're going to miss your target. And at that point, you're just making noise.
There were a lot of things that you were doing in this way, like repeating.
This was just the one that really stood out to me. But yes, there was other things that we did as well, where it's the same stuff over and over and over and over and over. And a lot of times it's not really communicated or explained to us why we're doing this stuff that doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense on a regular basis. And then there's so much of it that 5 years, 10 years, 15 years later that I finally understood why we did that weird thing. And in my opinion, Marine Corps boot camp, 100% of it is to help you stay alive in combat. And again, almost all of it, they don't explain that there. They just tell you to do it, and you do it. And then later on in life, you might figure out why you did that really weird thing. So I'll give you another example here in a minute. But we spent almost a week pretending to shoot. So during that time, by the time we got to like day number 4, it seemed almost like a waste of time. of I've done this already for hours and hours and hours, and for me it was summertime, so it's rather warm and sweaty, and it just seems useless. And we're all young adults. Yeah, I was 18, so yeah, as a young adult, we're not very mature generally.
You want to move, like doing something.
We want to do cool stuff.
Yeah.
Stuff that's in movies.
Not such ridiculous.
Yeah. But coming over here, I see a massive difference, and I'm so appreciative of doing some of that stuff that seemed ridiculous at the time back in 2005, almost 20 years ago, that I see that if we had some of that level of training here, the Ukrainian military is able to do some pretty fantastic things. The invasion of Kursk is a great example of them doing some pretty fantastic things. But their level of being lethal on the battlefield would be on a completely different level if they had an opportunity to do the same type of training that we do in the United States. So another example that we did is, in boot camp, you're not allowed to just go to the bathroom whenever you want to. You generally go to the bathroom when you're told to. So my platoon was about 90 recruits because it was summertime, and people graduate high school, and that's the primary time to go into the military. So there's about 90 of us. So we take turns. About half of us go to the bathroom at a time. So it's like 40, 45 of us all going to the bathroom, and it's usually like 3 guys sharing one urinal, or 2, 3 guys sharing one toilet, and it's disgusting and funny and whatever. So, but when you're done, the instructions are, you go outside, you go to the hallway, and then you look at the wall. So you actually turn your head and you look at the wall to where your nose is maybe a couple centimeters off of the wall. And that's what you do until you receive your next instructions. And you stand there and you look at the wall, extremely close to each other, and just wait until everyone's done. And generally, you only have like 2 minutes to do everything you need to do in the bathroom, which is usually never enough when it's 45 guys all trying to do the same thing all at the same time. So there's always someone or a few guys that are using too much time for whatever reason. So the drill instructors, focus on that, and there's lots of yelling, and sometimes stuff is being thrown. When I was in, the drill instructors were not allowed to use physical violence to use. So it would just be a bunch of yelling and throwing stuff, and there's no physical violence. So like no one's getting physically hurt. It's all mental. And that was, I think,
all this seemed like, sir, yes, sir. From the movie.
Yeah, from the movie. A lot of verbal insults, and some of the verbal insults are extremely funny. The hardest part for me in boot camp was just trying to keep a straight face and not laugh during some of the funny stuff that I heard and saw. So there's lots of yelling and screaming. The drill instructor is yelling at the recruit. The recruit is yelling back, sir, yes, sir, all this stuff, and we're trying not to laugh. But the instructions are, you're not looking at that. You're looking at the wall. So, again, no one ever explained this. Years and years and years later, I finally understood why that is. Because when you're in a combat situation and your job is to be looking to the north to cover, that building because there might be enemy forces over there, and if the guy next to you is screaming, maybe because they got hit or something, if you turn and look at him to see what's going on with him, then that's a good way to get shot in the face. You're no longer covering your sector. You're no longer doing your job. So out in the battlefield, sometimes it's normal that if there's shooting going on, someone might be screaming for a minute. And sometimes that's telling you that there's a big problem. And sometimes you have to understand that it's okay for him to be screaming. If he's screaming, he's still alive, and someone, we could figure out who will be the responsible person that can stop what they're doing and go help that person. And maybe it's going to be me. But I can only do that if I find someone else that could cover my sector, so that way I'm not giving up my job. Because if I give up my job, then we're all in more danger. Because obviously the person screaming isn't able to do their job. They're hurt. Maybe their leg is missing now or something like that. So that's where something like that, something as small as not paying attention to the yelling that's going on in the bathroom, of this funny, silly insults and stuff like that. That's where I understood that. To ignore all the extra noise that does not matter for the job that you're tasked to do in that moment.
Probably this is maybe the matter why we are speaking to each other now, following this from the first point of view, like ridiculous, but very important instructions.
Yes.
And knowledge. After your training, you were deployed to Iraq. for a combat mission. What was your impression when you get there? Because it's 1,000 and 1,000 kilometers from your home, and it's different culture, even different climate and other things.
So first, it was seen that so much of the environment was very similar to the training areas that I got to experience and train in the state of California. The training base that I was stationed at that time, 29 Palms, California, is part of the Mojave Desert. So a lot of what goes on there with the climate, the weather, the terrain is very similar to what I found in both Iraq and Afghanistan. We actually had a joke that the Marine Corps didn't send us to Iraq. They just flew us around for a few days in the air and then landed us back at the base in just a different part of the base for us to, play Marine for a long time. So that was something that made me just grateful for the training that I had, that the training matched the environment. And that's something that I got to see some of the differences when, like, for example, I spent a little bit of time in Hawaii at Scout Sniper School there back in 2009. And over in Hawaii, it's a completely different environment. So something that I saw there, that the Marine Corps units that are there, the training that they're doing on Hawaii doesn't really match very well to Iraq or Afghanistan. It just happens to be what they have access to. And so they do a pretty good job of adjusting their training so that way when they do end up in Iraq and Afghanistan, they still do things that make sense. But for me, I was just very fortunate to be in a very good environment for the training. So that was my first impression. The second was being in a new environment where the entire country is the battlefield.
Yeah.
So some people say the same about here, but it's just in a different context. Here, there's cruise missiles that can come in anywhere, but there's no artillery hitting Kyiv, for example. Cruise missiles are coming in from thousands of kilometers away, or drones or something like that. But, no one is in Kyiv with rifles. No one's in Kyiv with grenades. No one's in Kyiv with, tanks or anything like that, at least today. So, that part of the battlefield just doesn't exist unless you're close to the front lines. In Iraq or Afghanistan, because it was us fighting an insurgency, that means that the enemy's everywhere. Sometimes they have mortars, sometimes they have rockets, but it's, a lot of explosive devices. Sometimes they're wearing a suicide vest, so they're trying to get as close as they can to you, and then they're going to explode. And that's something that forces you to look at every single person very differently. That you have to look at them and decide sometimes in less than a second, is this person just a normal person, or is this person in the process of trying to kill you?
And interested in which metrics you have for that, like what you were looking for.
It depends on the situation. So if it's vehicles, we were trained to look a lot at the back tires, because we learned that if someone's using a car bomb, then the trunk of the vehicle is going to be very, very heavy, and the vehicle is going to be holding a lot more weight than it was designed to carry with the explosives. And a lot of times they'll put maybe some concrete first in the bottom of the trunk and then put explosives on top of that. So that way it directs most of the blast up and out instead of down back into the ground. So that way it increases the amount of casualties.
And what about people when you're looking at someone and you need to decide? How did you decide? One
of the ways is if they're clean shaven. So your average Arab man has a beard. One of the things that they'll do, not all of them, but one of the things that they'll do sometimes is if they intend to die in the very near future, like later that day, for example, within their culture and within their religion, then they want to present themselves to Allah, their God, in a very good fashion. So they'll, have a fresh shave. So that's something that if an Arab man has a fresh shave, then that's something that we would notice. And then we'd be looking very specifically more at the rest of their body of, does it look like they're wearing a vest with explosives? Sometimes that's easy to see, and sometimes it's not. It really just depends on what they're wearing. Over there in Iraq, part of the culture is westernized. So for example, like I've been to the University of Baghdad. Over there, a lot of the people are dressed exactly as what you'd expect in any other Western university with, tight blue jeans, tight shirts.
And this was a surprise for you? You didn't expect to see it?
For me, yes. Yes, because from what I knew is most, Iraqi people, men and women, are wearing, we call them like the man dresses. So seeing them wear, especially the women, it was seeing them wear like tight t-shirts and tight jeans, usually with English writing on it, which then makes me wonder, do they even know what the t-shirt says? Sometimes it's obvious that they don't because of what it says, and that they probably wouldn't wear that if they knew what that meant. So it's funny for us. So it really just depends on what they're wearing. But then the enemy over there was also pretty intelligent, that they saw initially that we really only targeted the men and that we really didn't search the women. So a lot of the women, if they're, you know, very immersed in the culture there, you know, they're wearing, you know, the big, I can't remember what they call it, but, you know, they kind of look like ninjas. You know, they're fully covered except for their eyes.
Hijab, I don't know.
Yeah, I believe that's correct. So for that, it's extremely easy to hide a suicide vest under that. And within their culture, it's extremely disrespectful for a man to touch a woman at all, especially a foreign man like an American touching an Iraqi woman. Like that will cause people to become fighters that were not going to be fighters that day. So we really can't do that. So, you know, that was something that they learned pretty early on, that we're not checking really the women at all. So they would send out their women sometimes with suicide vests, and, you know, some of those women were able to kill a lot of good people. And then they also noticed that we were not checking the children. So, you know, after a while, they would send out the children with rifles, with grenades, with explosives. So then that changes everything for us. Now that means that sometimes, you know, we're put in situations where we had to decide, you know, are we going to be shooting women now? And then we got to decide, are we going to be shooting children now? That's stuff that, thankfully, from what I'm told and understand, you know, that wasn't really an issue during World War II. You know, fighting the Nazis, fighting the Japanese, fighting, you know, for a while the Italians. That it was men fighting men.
Yeah.
And that if there was a woman on the battlefield fighting, that it was a woman wearing a uniform, that it wasn't some civilian, that wasn't a woman just trying to be a civilian that's trying to sneak in and something like that. That's one of the things that I am grateful for the battlefield here. That the battlefield here, they're wearing uniforms. So, you know, we actually know who we're shooting at, and they're not doing sneaky stuff. However, you know, out there in the East, there can be a lot of Russian sympathizers that are civilians. And so we know that we cannot fully trust the civilians out there, that they themselves won't try to kill us. But if they have access to a phone, then they might call someone that can kill us. And we know that that's happened. You know, there's been plenty of civilians arrested and gone to jail here in Ukraine that, you know, SBU or GUR was able to figure out that they, you know, made phone calls to Russian friends or whoever that gave enough intel to kill Ukrainians or foreigners or both. So,
and how often did you decide to shoot in Iraq when you saw the woman or child?
It's hard to answer that because it's, you know, case by case. It depends on where we're at. Sometimes we're operating in villages. Sometimes we're operating in very urban cities to where there's, you know, more women and children compared to other places. And you know, if we're in cities,
the level of danger. Yeah.
It's a level of danger, and then part of its context. So if we're in a more rural village, then no one's going to be wearing Western stuff in a rural village. But in the city, you know, it's, you know, some people are going to be wearing the Western stuff, and if they're wearing the Western stuff, then it can be more easy to tell, do they have a vest on or something like that. In the villages, not so much. And when we're interacting with the villages, then usually we have a pretty good understanding of how friendly this village is to us compared to being friendly to either like the Taliban in Afghanistan or Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So each area is really just case by case. And you know, we're watching a lot of just the details of how the person's moving. If they're limping, doesn't make sense for them to be limping, or are they too young to be limping, and they're limping because they're carrying a lot more weight today than they would normally be carrying. So it's a lot of just attention to detail, and part of it's just understanding within the experience, looking to your senior leadership, and then, you know, pointing out some of the specifics from their previous combat deployments of what they learned from their previous combat deployments, the very specific things to look for, the stuff that might seem important that actually isn't important, and then especially the stuff that seems to be not important, how important that can be, and the little bit small stuff. And our interpreters would help us out a lot also. That our interpreters were usually, you know, local Iraqis or local Afghanis, you know, respectively. So they would be able to tell us also how the interactions are going, because almost none of us speak Arabic. So the interpreters would be able to tell us, you know, how angry the people were or how friendly the people were based on the specific words that he's hearing them talking about. from the locals. So, he would be in constant communication with us of him letting us know that, everything seems to be okay, or we need to watch out that something might happen in the next 5 minutes.
I'm asking about this because the US invasion of Iraq was and remains kind of controversial from the point of view of international law and public opinion. And what is your position on this?
So for me, I would have to say that I believe that based on the information that was known at the time by the leadership at the time, that I believe that they made the best decision based on what they knew at the time. And sometimes, even for myself being in a leadership role, both as a civilian, just being a manager of a bunch of employees, or being out on the battlefield, that, there's times where you might only have a small amount of information, and you might not even understand that is a small amount of information, that it might seem like a lot of information, and you make a decision. And sometimes, a day or two goes by, or a year or something, and you realize I would have made different decisions if I knew more information in that moment. But I made the best decision that I could, given the information that I had in that moment. And sometimes you could correct that decision, and then sometimes the decision's made and there's no way to reverse that decision. So for that, I have full respect for the leadership, especially the office of the President of the United States, regardless of who the president is in any given moment, whether I agree with their policies or not. I have full respect for that office and the weight and the burden that comes with that office of making these decisions, of sending your own people to war, which includes, at least for the United States, that when the United States sends their people to war, then a lot of NATO countries are roped into that, whether they want to be or not. They understand that if the United States is going to war with someone, then NATO needs to be a part of it also. So that's something that when the U.S. president makes that decision, right or wrong, it comes with not just the burden of American lives, but a lot of foreign lives as well. Obviously, with whoever the enemy happens to be in that moment, their lives are going to be changed. But I do know that during my time physically in Iraq or Afghanistan, and I'm much more familiar with Iraq because I went back there as a security contractor for thousands of days and interacted with a lot of locals. So many of them were actually angry that the U.S. military formally left Iraq. I believe that was in 2014. They were angry about that. And that for them, a lot of them really wanted the Iraqi country to be basically under U.S. and NATO martial law with a U.S. general in charge, like it was during, the active wartime. Because your average Iraqi person doesn't hate America. They just want to be able to drive to work and not get blown up by Al-Qaeda in the process. Over there, I got to interact with, like Iraqi judges, for example, that, every day their life is in danger. Because if they are fully doing their job, then some of the people that they're pitting away in jail, have family members that are connected to terrorist cells that, judges sometimes get assassinated. Thankfully, we don't really have that problem in the United States. I'm thankful for that. And that helps provide a security within our judicial system that the judges in America, most of the time, are making really good decisions because they're not in fear of their own personal lives being assassinated or something like that. So, but over there, it's a big, big problem. So a lot of the people there, it was a completely different environment when Saddam was running that country. The country was semi-safe, from what I was told, and very clean because Saddam was the only one allowed to be, killing people or people that had Saddam's authority. So if you said or did the wrong thing one day, then Saddam or the people under his authority would happily kill you and your entire family, and there's nothing you could do about it. I talked to locals that would explain to me that if they woke up in the morning after having a dream about Saddam, and it was some kind of negative dream about Saddam, that they would spend usually the next week terrified. That maybe there's some way that Saddam or his family or his people will find out that this random person had a bad dream about this guy, and they're going to come in and kill the whole family.
So it's hard to believe.
That's how bad things were for your average person, from what they told me. So a lot of them, similar to Ukrainians being shocked that Russia launched a full-scale invasion, it was a similar level of shock and awe for a lot of these people when they heard and saw the United States and NATO coming into their country. So, we destroyed a lot of stuff there, killed a lot of people, whatever. But we're pretty good about separating the civilians from military targets as long as it's, obvious that they're not a military target. So, but I got to talk to so many locals that were shocked and so incredibly thankful that someone came in that removed this, from what they described to me, this nightmare from their life. And so, for example, like I've personally never found a Ukrainian that, dreams about, Russia, Putin, being murdered or whatever, and then is in fear of their life. That wouldn't be a thing. Or
not on that level.
Maybe Zelensky, whatever. Like that's not really a fear that I personally have experienced with the Ukrainian people, but with Iraqi people, especially in and around Baghdad, where the capital, that was a fear, and that's something that the American people, myself, we don't understand that because we've never had that problem. Thankfully, I would assume that was probably a big problem in like Nazi Germany. That, if you didn't support, Hitler, then, you will absolutely be executed, especially if you're vocal about it.
Probably, yeah.
So, but for that made it, such an honor to be there representing the United States, providing protection and freedom to these people that were afraid to have dreams.
You also were the part of U.S. force in Afghanistan.
Yes.
And the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan, it was like a few years ago, led to complicated consequences also. How do you perceive those events? Because there are a lot of observers who are saying like this was the tragedy for the US, like this was humiliation. How do you think?
So first, I'll start by saying that when you're on a low level of decision making, it's easy to see that the high level decisions are stupid or are really smart, whatever. If you have zero of the information or close to zero of the information, that was one thing that I really got to fully understand and learn at my previous job before Ukraine, of being a program manager of so many people. And 80 people is not really a lot, but for me at the time, it was more than I had previously. And that contract was worth, over $10 million a year. So it was kind of a big deal for what I had done at that point in my life. And there was times where I made decisions, and then I heard from some of the lower, employees, that were my staff, I would hear rumors about how, Matthew made another stupid decision. And sometimes I had the opportunity to explain to them and talk to them. And sometimes there's not that opportunity. You just do what you're told, and the boss is the boss is a boss. And, you just do what you're told.
Do you believe that this was a good decision for America?
I know that when you leave a combat zone, that it could be very dangerous to leave a combat zone. So the way you do it matters very heavily. There's a fairly famous battle that happened in Vietnam that I got to read about. And they made a movie about part of the battle called We Were Soldiers with Mel Gibson in it. And in that movie, there's part of the battle where the battle's over and people are flying away in the movie. But, part of the real story, if you read the book, is that they couldn't fly away because they were they won the battle, but they're still horribly outnumbered. And that in that moment, the aircraft that could fly out all the friendly forces could not fly out all of them in one flight. So they made multiple trips to bring everyone in. So they got to make multiple trips to bring everyone out. And I don't remember what the time difference is, but I would say that it was minimum maybe 30 minutes flight time, which means that every round trip is about an hour. So if half your force leaves, then that means that at a minimum, you have an hour out there by yourself. And any enemy that's paying attention, that's a prime opportunity to kill everyone that's left.
Yeah.
Because half of them just left. So for that, when you leave a battlefield, whether it's permanently or just for a couple of days, the way you leave matters a lot because the enemy's always watching it. Unless you can guarantee that you killed every single one of them, then the way you leave actually matters. So the reality of that story is a lot of them all had to leave together, which means they had to walk. So an area that they flew into, that takes maybe 30 minutes, to fly into, and that may not even be an accurate flight time, but I know that it was a minimum of 30 minutes, so it was probably longer. But I believe they spent multiple days walking out of there to get back to their base. And the whole time that they're walking for multiple days, they're fighting the whole time. So that was just that story. So for this, walking out of Afghanistan is not an option. You have to fly out. So in my opinion, there's no way to fly everyone out really immediately, except for the way that they did it during this recent withdrawal. They got everyone out as quickly as possible. And what that does is that removes or limits the enemy's capability of attacking whoever's left. Now, I do know that there's been interviews that are readily available online where President Trump talks about where he talked with the leader of the Taliban numerous times. And he explained to the leader of the Taliban that, I want to remove my forces and I plan to do that safely. So my plan is to remove my forces and you will not touch any of them. That I will be allowed to remove all of my forces and I will remove all of them. As long as you don't touch any of them, you don't endanger any of them.
Yeah, it seems like a good deal.
It seems like
it
seems like a good deal. During that interview, obviously I wasn't part of any part of that conversation. All I know is what the interview and what President Trump is talking about in that interview. And in that interview, President Trump gave a picture of the Taliban leader's house to him to let him know, and he very verbally said that I will personally, no, sorry, he didn't say personally, that I will kill you if any of my people get hurt during this withdrawal. And then provided the photo of the Taliban leader's house to show that we know where the guy lives and we will absolutely kill this man if he, endangers the American force. That seems like one of the better ways, from my perspective as a warfighter, to remove your forces is to make sure that your adversary understands that this is how it's going to happen. And if they violate this, that there's going to be reckoning and they're going to lose their life if this gets violated. So that means that individual needs to communicate to all of their fighters to stop. So that way we can leave and continue discussions. So I honestly have no idea how any of that interaction went once President Trump was no longer in office and it was President Biden. So I honestly have no idea how that went. So I really can't speak on how good or bad of a decision it was for us to withdraw the way we did. I do know, and we saw this a little bit like with Vietnam, that it is cheaper for the United States generally to leave equipment in the battlefield instead of trying to get it back to the United States, or unless there's a battlefield nearby, a new one to move it to. If it's not nearby, then it's cheaper for the United States, it's cheaper for the US taxpayer to just leave it there and just buy a new one. And sometimes that means that stuff ends up in enemy hands. Sometimes the local government's able to either purchase it from us or we're able to just essentially donate it to the local government. So that's something that's just normal for warfare, especially for the United States being away from the wars. It was a lot of the same, I believe, during World War II, that the United States shipped an obscene amount of equipment into Europe for World War II, both stuff that we used and stuff that, we sent to the Soviets that the Soviets used. A lot of Soviets used American tanks.
It was a lot of stuff.
So a lot of that, again, great examples of a lot of that can be cheaper just to leave it in Europe than try to get it back home. So
you previously said to me that you were not surprised by the news from Bucha when you heard it on American television, because you heard from the locals in Afghanistan that Russians were acting the same way. They were raping, they were killing, they were robbing and doing all the stuff that we saw. Why do you think they are always acting that way? Maybe you have a version, kind of suggestion. What leads them to be such kind of human being?
In my experience, in my perspective, that it's just a different of cultures. That for my culture, we value life quite a bit. And I believe from especially the Russian and former Soviet culture, the value of life is very low and very little. Now, with that said, the American history includes that there was a time that we only valued white lives, for example. Yeah. And or I should say, white European lives. There's a lot of, what's known is, we treated blacks very poorly. What's generally not as well known is that blacks treated blacks very poorly, and that's how they ended up in our country, first of all. And also, we treated the Chinese horribly also. We brought in, a lot of Chinese came into the United States, and they're known for helping us build our railroad system during the 1800s. And we treated them horribly. The Irish came in, we treated them horribly. So we were nice enough, I think, that we didn't just single out, the black people from Africa, that we treated anyone that was not of European descent pretty horribly. Yeah. So it was just a thing. So it's within our history also, and it took us some time to stop doing that nonsense and realize that we're all kind of on the same team, and let's all just treat each other fairly and whatever. So we're in a much better place now than we were, 200 years ago. But we're also a very young country. For the culture that I've seen from my perspective, over there with like the Russians, it's part of their culture of they're better than everyone else. And because they're better than everyone else, then everyone else's lives don't really matter very much. We got to see that a little bit also with World War II with the Nazis and with the Japanese. The Japanese even looked at other Asians as being not really worthy of living.
Yeah.
So when they invaded, all these other areas, the Philippines, China, that even though there were other fellow Asians that looked similar, that, they are not worthy. The Japanese are the best people in the world, and same thing with the Nazis. So, that was just very common for those cultures. So I think that's a big difference where, the Russian culture is that they're just better than everyone else. So if you're not part of the Russian culture, and if you're not Russian, then your value of life is even less than what it would be for other Russians. And that's something that is at least not currently normal, at least for my generation, my lifetime in the United States, that we see every life of having, pretty substantial value, even enemy lives, that once an enemy stops fighting and they're wounded, we are obligated, not just by law, but by our culture, to do everything we can to help keep that person alive, even though that they were trying to kill us, 2 minutes ago. And that's something that not every culture has that.
Yeah.
It's something that is a big difference here in Ukraine, actually, that the Ukrainian side, when a Russian surrenders, if they're wounded, the Ukrainian side does a pretty good job of risking their lives within reason to go and help save that Russian guy, or that Russian person, to keep them alive, to fix their wounds, and to provide safety to them, to include, risking our lives to keep them safe, because, the Russian artillery doesn't just magically stop because we have a Russian now. So even when we've taken Russian prisoners, like we go pretty far out of our way to keep them safe, give them food if there's extra food, and treat them with respect, where we know that even today, the current times, that the Russians are not known for treating Ukrainians or foreigners with levels of respect. There's so many videos online that, first off, when someone does something not very nice and records it on video and then allows that video to leak online, or is proud of that video so they intentionally post it online, that's a special type of person that does something like that.
Special.
So when Russians take prisoners of war and then murders them now, because now it's not just killing, it's murder. This person is no longer a threat. And, there's laws that govern warfare that the Russians, a lot of the Russians are not respecting, that we are pretty good at respecting. That, there's just all this evidence of, even today, they still don't have that respect and value for life to take care of prisoners of war when they surrender. And that's something that is a big cultural difference between us and them. And that's one of those cultural differences that's not just a difference, but one is better and one is worse.
Do you think it might change, or we will live with such kind of people nearby for
I've learned,
centuries? Like,
it's hard to answer that, because I've learned that it's extremely difficult and challenging to change something that is such a cultural foundation. And that's something that, in my experience, and I shouldn't say my experience, from my research and understanding of world history, it's very hard to change that. And I think the examples that we could look at is World War II and in Iraq, Afghanistan. In Iraq and Afghanistan, we were fighting a cultural difference where, you know, we have different religions, but also very different cultures. That over there, you know, one of the things that I saw that was horrific out in the more rural areas of Iraq and Afghanistan is, like, for example, this is, you know, it's slightly more graphic, that, you know, sex is not meant to be pleasurable for both the man and the woman in the very traditional culture over there. So this isn't everybody, but especially in the more rural areas where there's villages that, you know, you're nowhere near any cities, that they have very small clinics set up just to remove parts of the woman, so that way the woman experiences either zero or the least amount of pleasure during, you know, sexual activities. And that's something that when they're doing this, like I've been in those villages when some of these operations are happening, all you hear is just screaming, because there's no anesthesia, there's no painkillers, none of that is, and it's not it's not considered like a bad, evil thing that they're doing. It's just part of their culture, that women are there to provide babies and stuff like that, and there's no reason for them to enjoy that. So it's something that they don't see as a bad thing, and it's just part of their culture that's how it is. So combating stuff like this, it's very challenging. And so for Iraq and Afghanistan, we were there for almost 20 years in each one. And for some of these differences, we did nothing to really influence these differences. And including when I was there in 2020, that I knew that, you know, I was not allowed to just walk around Baghdad by myself. That wasn't a thing. But we understood that if you do that, you're at extremely high risk as a clear American that's white, when over there, you know, most Arabs are kind of brown and look different. You know, I stand out. That if I were to walk around there by myself, that there'd be a high risk of me being kidnapped and then very soon put in front of a camera, and then my head's going to be sawed off from my body while on camera, and that video footage is going to be shared to as many people around the world as possible. So even after being there for 20 years, that we were not able to share that part of our culture of that's a wrong thing to do. You compare that to World War II, that at the beginning of like the 40s, Nazi Germany was a pretty massive superpower at the time. You know, they were extremely organized. Their army was fantastic. Their air force was fantastic. Their navy was annoyingly good at what they were doing. The Japanese were also very battle-hardened by the time that they attacked the United States in 1941. So they were also very organized, very good. Their navy was fantastic, and the army was doing was very, very good. So both of those had very different cultures, and what we talked about earlier is extremely racist cultures. That if you were not, you know, white in, you know, Nazi Germany, then, you know, you're probably going to be killed at some point.
Yeah.
If you were not Japanese, it just didn't matter. If you weren't Japanese, you know, your life is worthless. But we have very good relationships with both of those countries today, to where that entire part of the culture no longer exists. And part of that is we conducted warfare differently then. That we were able, the United States, along with all these other countries that helped us, we were able to combat both of these massive powers, these military mighty powers. Basically, at the same time, we were only at war for a few years, and we had clear victories in this war. But I think we went into those wars with the cultural, contextual statement of, you will change your entire culture, and we will kill you until you change your entire culture, because we decided your culture is bad, and our culture is better. So you can either choose to change your culture on your own, or we're just going to keep killing your people until there's no one left. And that's how we went into Berlin. That's how we went into Tokyo. And it worked really well. And since then, we keep our military bases there, because we know that we've learned that, especially the Germans, that sometimes if there's not adult supervision, that they like start a war with the entire world. And so now, you know, we still keep military bases there, but we have fantastic relationships with both Germany and Japan now. And they are seen as very good allies to anyone else in the world that is really just trying to have peaceful life. You know, there's nothing about the German people today where they want to start another world war. and try to take over Europe or anything like that. So that's a huge difference, that we just went into that with you will change everything about yourself or we're just going to kill everybody here. Whereas Iraq and Afghanistan, we didn't really do that. In Iraq and Afghanistan, like, we started off just, attacking the military force, which was easy for our side of it. I wasn't there for the invasion, but from my understanding, it was hard fighting, but generally in the big picture, it was pretty easy. They didn't really have much of an air force. Our air force is pretty fantastic, and we just bombed the snot out of them. So when it came to interacting with the locals, we just did not really communicate, your culture needs to change. Parts of your culture are bad, and your culture needs to change. That, the idea of looking at non-Muslims as infidels and as a threat to Islam is, in my opinion, bad. That's not how a biblical following Christian looks at non-Christians. We don't see them as like a threat to Christianity and maybe we need to kill them. It's just someone I get to interact with. And, Jesus Christ was a great example of, he went out of his way to interact with people that were clearly not, people that would be going to church. He would spend time with some pretty shitty people. Yeah. And that was part of it, he's not there to convert people. He was there to spend time. And during that time, he would convert people because, they could see that this guy's clearly different. He's not necessarily preaching at me. He's not forcing me to believe his ways or anything like that. He was just, here I am. I do things differently. And it's your choice if you want to, see what I'm doing. So Iraq and Afghanistan, we just didn't do that. So, looking at Russia, it's going to be very challenging to really change that part of the culture.
Challenging or impossible?
Possibly,
from your point of view.
Possibly impossible, just because warfare is a little bit different today. And, if you have nuclear weapons, then, that just changes things as well. When we went into, for example, like Afghanistan is a great example. We invade Afghanistan. Well, Afghanistan doesn't have any nukes, so we could use...
Yeah, it's pretty much clear.
We can use conventional warfare of just regular bullets and stuff, and that's all it's going to be, and that's okay. In World War II, for most of World War II, no nukes, so, we're just going to shoot at each other a lot. Well, now with, countries having nuclear weapons that could usually reach anywhere in the world in less than an hour, that means that things need to be done differently. So, I know some people would love to fully have Russia invaded and conquered, but in my opinion, as a warfighter, I just don't see that being a realistic possibility. Just like I don't see that as being a realistic possibility that things would go well if Ukraine gets fully conquered. Like, that's just going to be bad for business for everybody, not just for Ukraine, but for Europe and the rest of the world. So, a lot of people would love to just invade Russia and conquer Moscow. I don't see that as being super great. A lot of people have tried to invade Russia, usually during the wintertime. It hasn't really gone too well. And part of it is, I don't think they have a whole lot to offer. That, sometimes you invade a country because they have resources that you don't have, and their lands and their territories can increase the value to your empire. And, Russia just doesn't have a whole lot, in my opinion. Like, they do produce some energy, but especially in the last couple of years, a lot of European nations have moved their energy dependence to other areas, to where the energy that Russia was producing is being used less. I know that even the U.S. was using Russian rockets for a long time, and I think some entities of the United States is still doing that. But like SpaceX is a great example. One of Elon's companies, they build their own rockets, and they recognize that the Russian rockets are fantastic, very, very good. But they, one of the reasons that they build their own rockets is so that way they're not dependent on some other nation that might from time to time do some crazy stuff that creates problems.
How do you see the solution of this problem? That probably it will be impossible to change Russian culture, but we need a strong Ukraine. We need Ukraine to survive and to move on in these obstacles.
That I think it would have to, from what I've been told, countries like Estonia isn't super concerned about Russian culture because they are fully independent. They've gone pretty far out of their way to fully adopt the Western culture and to purposely expel Eastern Russian culture out of their country completely. Like, Russians are allowed to live there, but it's kind of clear that they're not fans of Russia, and they're not allowed to be within, I think, their government and stuff like that. So I think it would have to be a very clean break in that regard, very fully adopting the Western culture completely and being very adamant about removing all the corruption that's coming out of Russia out of the country. And that's just a big job that, you know, it comes to like the Ukrainian leadership to really be able to do that and figure out who are the people within Ukrainian government, Ukrainian military, you know, some of these policy members that are more on the Russian side of things, and remove them as quickly and efficiently as possible and replace them with the correct people. You know, you can't just replace them with just anyone, but the correct people. And that's something that, where, you know, we discussed earlier, you know, sharing each other's cultures, that, you know, I enjoy sharing part of the American culture, that, you know, some of the, you know, we have a lot of problems with our political system. You know, it's ridiculous at times, but I also see that it's probably the best political system in existence today, that we could have, you know, people from different parties argue about an issue like a Ukraine aid package for months and months and months, sometimes yelling at each other, but no one's getting shot. No one's shooting at the U.S. Capitol. You don't have Republicans and Democrats shooting at each other. Like, it just doesn't exist. And whereas in a place like Russia, as a politician, as far as I understand, you're not really allowed to disagree with the Kremlin.
Yeah, because you might be
you'll disappear.
Yeah,
and your family's going to disappear. You know, part of that is, you know, similar from what I've seen in Iraq and Afghanistan, that if you disagree with the wrong person, that your family disappears. So that's something that makes our culture really awesome, that there's almost an encouragement to disagree, and it's okay to disagree. And it's okay that we can have two different views and opinions about something, even something like, you know, should we support Ukraine more or less? Like, I fully support the people that say stop supporting Ukraine, for those that are in America, because they have the freedom to say that. And they have the freedom to say that without anything legally happening to them, that there's nothing legally I could do to that person. They are fully protected by our U.S. Constitution. And I find that fantastic, that someone can see an issue and decide that they have a decision about it, whether they're educated about it or not, and make this decision. And that brings me to a role model of mine that I won't share her name, but it's easy to find. But it was a U.S. Congresswoman in the 40s, and she was representing the state of Montana at the time. And this lady, I don't know a whole lot about her, but in 1941, in December, Congress came together, and they had to vote, because Congress is the ones that declare war. So Congress came together to decide, will we declare war on Japan? Because this was, you know, right after the attack on Pearl Harbor. And this lady, her entire campaign was as a pacifist, of anti-war, no violence, that's how she got elected into office, of her being someone that does not support war whatsoever. And this lady she's the only person in Congress to vote no about should we declare war on Japan, after Japan just killed thousands of our service members on the attack on Hawaii. So clearly we're at war, whether we agree with her or not. And this lady had the balls to stand by her principles, to stand by everything that she has ever said, you know, on camera, off camera, to the people that hired her, to say something that I disagree with this, and I will not send people to fight because I disagree with this. So my vote is no. And that is super cool, that, you know, she ended up losing her job. She was not reelected, but she was not taken out and executed. And during that moment, as a warfighter, I could understand wanting to take her out and execute her right on the footsteps of the Capitol, because clearly that's the wrong decision, in my opinion. Someone attacked us. We need to go to war. We're going to go to war, whether she votes yes or no. It doesn't even matter, right? She could have even, so in U.S. Congress, you can even vote, you could either vote yes or no, or you could just not vote at all. You can abstain. So it's the same thing as just not showing up to work that day. She could have abstained, and that would have avoided all of this. But she intentionally went to work that day to intentionally be the only person, and as a woman in politics in the 40s, that was a big deal, to vote no for this. And that is something that example, and the fact that she wasn't executed right later that day, is an example of one thing that makes our political system so fantastic, that you can disagree, even if your disagreement doesn't make any sense at all to the rest of us, and it's okay. And that's something that culture, I love that culture that we have in the US. And unfortunately, that means that at times we had to argue about, should we support Ukraine or not, because this might prevent a world war, and like a lot of, you know,
but you have a possibility for that.
Yeah, and you know, so some voters don't understand that we're trying to prevent a world war here, that if we don't do this properly, that America will go to war with some other country here in the near future, and now we're going to have a lot of dead Americans, you know, or NATO members. So that's something that with the Russian culture, I honestly don't know how we would, you know, be able to change that, other than at least making sure that there is a clear-cut border of, that's your land, do whatever you want in your land, and if you come outside your land, we're going to kill everybody.
Matthew, thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you very much for being a big friend of free world, and thank you very much for being a big friend of Ukraine. Thank you.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.